Right now in America, we are spending an awful lot of our time fighting with each other. We fight on Facebook and on Twitter. We fight in the streets of our cities and on our college campuses. And all of this fighting with each other would be bad enough if it simply made people miserable or if it spilled over into occasional violence as it does. But the reason it's a crisis we need to face is because from our local communities to the halls of Congress, all of this fighting is preventing us from meeting the real challenges that face us. And the challenges are not waiting around for us. Storms of increasing intensity threaten our coastal cities. Wildfires sweep across Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, destroying crops and homes and businesses. Opioid addiction has brought communities in West Virginia and Kentucky and Ohio and across the United States to their knees. The challenges are ongoing, we are fighting with each other, and we need to come to terms with that reality. I don't have a silver bullet that will solve this problem. I don't think anybody does. But what I want to share with you is a way of thinking about our relationships with each other that can give us the opportunity to move forward out of the current morass in which we sit. And to do that, I want to share with you a story from my own family about a conversation many years ago with my father. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think we can derive from that story. And then say a bit about how that can give us a way of thinking differently about how we connect with other people now and into the future. So please allow me to head back about 40 years to the summer of 1979. I was an 11-year-old boy, and I was headed off for a 4-day kayaking adventure with my father. We were headed to the Delaware River on the border between New York and Pennsylvania to spend 4 days together, and I was really excited about it. My father built it up. I was the youngest of 4 kids. This was a chance for just the 2 of us to spend some time together, and he talked about how we would camp by the side of the river and cook our own food and live off the land, and I was excited about it. And we headed up, and the first stop on a trip like that is at the outfitter's shop. And you go there, and that's where you rent your boat, and you get yourself a map. And for the younger members of our audience, a map is a picture of the earth stamped on a dead tree. If you haven't thought of inventing Google Maps yet, that's what you have to use. So we got that equipment, we got that gear, we put it all on the outfitter's truck, and he drove us about 60 miles up the river. And the outfitter was a guy about 10 or 15 years older than my father, an immigrant from Germany. And they spoke together in German a little bit, and then they switched back to English so that I wouldn't be left out of the conversation. And we spent about 2 hours with this guy, all told, including that 60-mile drive. And the whole time, my father was chatting in a very friendly way with him, engaging him. And I could see, knowing my father well, that he was really working to make a connection so that this guy felt comfortable with these 2 strangers hanging out in his shop in his car for a couple of hours. And the whole time, I was baffled. And to explain why I was so confused, I need to tell you a little bit about my father's story. So he was born in 1926 in Berlin. And the first part of his childhood was very happy. He was from a very prosperous family. His father was a successful attorney, and his early childhood was full of happy memories. And in 1933, with the rise of the Nazi regime, everything was turned on its head for his family and all the members of the German Jewish community. And from then on, life became a nightmare. And he and his mother and his sister eventually escaped, came to the United States. His father did not get out and ended up dying in a Nazi camp. And I knew all of this history, and I could not understand how my father, there with a man who was precisely of the age where he could have been directly involved in those events, I could not understand how my father could be so friendly, could be working to make a connection with him, to make him feel comfortable with us as we spent time together. And I knew also that my father did not like to talk about this time in his life. It was, as you can imagine, quite painful. And so I really didn't want to ask him about it. But you spend 4 days together in a boat on a river, and just about every thought that enters your head will leave through your mouth. And so I finally asked my father about this. How could he have reached out in this way to this man? And my father did what he often did, which was he answered my question with a story. And so he took me back another 40 years to November of 1938, a night that we all now know as Kristallnacht. And for those of you not familiar with the history, on that night, Nazi troopers and paramilitaries and thugs set out in cities across Austria and Germany to torment the German Jewish community. They smashed the windows of Jewish-owned shops. They torched synagogues. They attacked Jews and rounded them up. Hundreds died that night, and hundreds more died later from the consequences of that night. And my father said on that night, he was at home with his mother and his sister. His father was out of the country on business, and the phone began to ring. And most of the calls came from other members of the Jewish community, friends, neighbors checking on each other, seeing how people in their community were doing. But he said some of the calls that night came from non-Jews, from clients of my grandfather and business associates who were reaching out to find out how the family was doing and to ask whether there was anything they could do to help. And my father said, I know that most Germans at that time were supportive of the Nazi regime, either actively or tacitly. Others were just not sufficiently concerned about their neighbors to bother to reach out. But he said, I also know that some German non-Jews reached out to us at great potential risk to themselves and their families to offer help. And he said, when I meet an individual German, if I don't know anything about their story, I have to assume that they're among the people who did the right thing. Because if I believe that we are all truly equal, and I would expect that treatment from them, that assumption that I am innocent until proven otherwise, then I have to offer that presumption to them. So at 11 years old, that was a lot for me to take in. And frankly, I have spent the last 4 decades trying to make full sense of everything that's packed into that story. And so what I want to do right now is just unpack a little bit of what's in there and talk about how I think it helps us find a way forward. So the first thing is, I want to say that I was left with an understanding that we have an obligation, active obligation, to treat others as if we really believe that we are all equal. And I want to call that the Walter Seligsohn principle. The idea that this isn't just an idea we repeat, but something that has to shape the way we treat others around us all the time. So if we take that seriously, if we take that principle seriously, what does it mean? The first thing I think it means is that we have an obligation to ask whether all the other people around us have an equal opportunity to shape the future of our communities. If we believe that each of us comes into the world no better than anyone else, with no more right to rule or lead or decide than anyone else, then we have to be asking whether the other people around us are really in a position to have an equal opportunity to shape the future of our community. The non-Jews who reached out to my family were saying that they weren't going to accept that others around them were denied that equality. So we have an obligation to think about that. And once we dwell on that for just a moment, we realize that's just another way of describing democracy. The idea that each of us ought to have an equal share in shaping the future of our community. So that's an active obligation we have. And once we recognize and accept that obligation, then we see that we also have to start asking, what are the barriers that others around us might face to really assuming that equal share in shaping the future of our communities? So for example, if I know that there are children right now growing up in communities across the country that are, because of opioid addiction, in a position where children are not getting the care they need, the nurturing they need, the educational opportunities they need, that is something I have to take account of. If I know there are children living in cities where, due to old water systems, their likelihood of being exposed to toxic levels of lead as children, with all of the cognitive and emotional consequences, the likelihood that they won't graduate school and instead will end up in prison, if I know that, I have an active obligation to address it. We live in a world where we are aware of these challenges, these realities that prevent others from sharing equally in the opportunity to shape their communities. We have an obligation to address it. Once we recognize that obligation, we can start to think about how we have to interact differently with our fellow citizens. So for example, I know an awful lot about the barriers that I have faced in my life. I know an awful lot about those faced by my friends and my family, by people whose lives are pretty much like mine, but I know very little, unless I do some work, about the actual barriers in the lives of people who are not like me, who are living in different circumstances, different parts of the country, who have different backgrounds, different belief systems. The only way I can actually undertake my obligation to ensure that all of us have an equal opportunity to shape the future of our communities and our country is by listening to others with different experiences. Not seeking to engage them so I can persuade them of my point of view, but learning about what their realities are, what they face on a daily basis, what their family situations are like, what it means for them to live in their communities. I may hear things that are unfamiliar to me, that are even unpleasant to me, but I can't really think I am undertaking my obligation to treat others equally if I am not doing that work. And once we recognize that we need to start listening to others in different ways, we also recognize that we have an obligation to take the comfortable ideas that we have sat with for years, the political parties we belong to, the political perspectives we bring, the ideologies that sound right to us and always have. We have to be willing to subject those to question. If I'm listening to others and learning something about their experiences, but just clinging to the ideas I brought in the first place, then the exercise is pointless. And I am not actually respecting their full equality, their full dignity. I have to be willing to say that the things I brought to the conversation might not survive the conversation, that I might change through the interaction, learn, and ultimately come out with different views. So that is putting this principle into action, taking the full equality of others seriously. It involves listening, it involves work, and it involves a willingness to suspend some of the views that we have sat with for years and that are deeply comfortable to us. So can we really do this? Can we actually put this into practice? Does this require us to be saints, to live in some way that humans just cannot? And I think the answer is no. I think we can live this way. And I say that because I've seen it, and I've seen it in particular from young people. And I just want to give you one example of some college students down at Western Carolina University I've gotten to know through the organization I lead, Campus Compact. These are a group of students who work together in a nonpartisan way to register students to vote in advance of the 2016 election. They registered folks, they led events that got people interested in the election. They did a lot of turnout work in a nonpartisan way. They were very excited because they felt like they'd gotten many of their peers involved in the political process in the run-up to the 2016 election. And on the day after the election, they felt terrible because they thought this would be a happy culmination, a celebration of our democracy, and what they saw instead was that the same people who were yelling at each other before were yelling at each other afterward. But instead of sitting there with their dejection, they decided to work together to envision the possibility of continuing to make change in their community. So these same students, Democrats and Republicans, they got together and they said, can we identify an issue that we can agree on enough to continue our work? And they hit on an unlikely one, which was the incarceration of juveniles based on being tried as adults in the court system. And they found that the conservative students didn't like that idea because they thought it was government overreach. They thought that where families and churches and communities should be helping to set young people back on the right course, now this was the government stepping in and taking on that role. Liberal students saw the mass incarceration state at work, and they saw racial injustice. They came at it from different perspectives, but by listening to each other, they discovered they shared a common concern. They went out and they started to reach out to legislators. They recruited a Republican member of the state legislature to co-sponsor a bill. That bill made it successfully through the Republican legislature in North Carolina, was signed into law by the Democratic governor, and there are now young people in North Carolina whose life chances are enormously better because those students and others who agreed with them worked to make change. They did it not on the basis of already agreeing with each other, but on the basis of a willingness to find agreement, discover common ground, not seek to change the views of everyone else based on their own, but to learn where they had opportunities to move forward. Can we really live like that? I think if my father could look in the eyes of a person who he knew might have been involved in the murder of his father or millions of others and treat him with dignity and respect as a fully equal human being, I think we can get it together to listen to each other, to work together, and to find common solutions to our shared challenges. Thank you very much.